My name is Daniel Mercer, and I'm 52 years old. For the past 17 years, I've worked as a senior corporate risk analyst at Transitronics, a logistics company headquartered in Houston, Texas. I'm the kind of professional who thinks 3 steps ahead, the guy who puts out fires before they even start. Methodical, quiet, and because of that, often underestimated. I've always been known for my calm demeanor and discretion. While others were making noise in meetings, I was the one actually reading the fine print, catching discrepancies that could cost the company millions. My colleagues respected my thoroughness, even if they didn't always appreciate my attention to detail. I was the safety net they didn't know they needed. If you enjoy stories of cold-blooded revenge and gripping plot twists like this video, and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new, unreleased stories here every day, each one more intense than the last. It was Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. My first day off in 3 months. I'd postponed this vacation day twice to finish a critical compliance report that could make or break a major contract negotiation. The kind of report that required someone with my 17 years of experience to validate properly. I was finally relaxing at home in my Katy suburb, sipping coffee and planning to spend the day working in my garage when my phone buzzed. 9:17 in the morning. A text message from an HR number I didn't recognize. No call, no meeting, no courtesy of a face-to-face conversation. Just a cold corporate message that read, "Your position has been terminated effective immediately. Please return all company equipment by Friday." I stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds. Then I set my phone down, took a deep breath, and smiled. They had no idea what they'd just done. More importantly, they had no idea where I was headed that very morning. The timing was almost poetic, because in exactly 2 hours I had a meeting scheduled with someone who knew Transitronics better than anyone currently working there. Someone who had his own reasons to see certain people at that company get exactly what they deserved. Someone who had been waiting for the right moment, the right ally to make his move. Bradley Hartwell. That was the name behind my sudden unemployment. The new director of operations who'd been systematically pushing out anyone he considered old guard. 34 years old, MBA from Rice University, and the kind of ambitious narcissist who disguised his power plays as structural modernization. He wanted his own team, his own loyal followers, and definitely no one around who might question his methods. The problem with Bradley was that he thought being young and educated made him smarter than everyone else. He assumed that guys like me, with our decades of experience and quiet ways, were just dinosaurs waiting to be extinct. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Over the past 8 months, I'd watched him operate. Meetings I used to lead suddenly happened without me. Reports I'd written for years were reassigned to his hand-picked junior analysts. Strategic decisions were made in closed-door sessions where my input was no longer valued. The writing had been on the wall. But I'm a patient man. I don't react, I prepare. When Sarah Martinez from HR quietly pulled me aside in early May and whispered, "They're trying to undermine you, Daniel. Be careful." I wasn't surprised. I was ready. Because for the past 6 months I'd been documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every policy violation, every financial irregularity that crossed my desk. See, when you're a risk analyst, you develop certain instincts. You learn to smell trouble before it becomes a crisis. And Bradley Hartwell reeked of trouble from day one. His aggressive cost-cutting measures, his tendency to bypass standard approval processes, his habit of forming partnerships with vendors that seemed to have suspiciously favorable terms for Transitronics. I'd been quietly building a file. Not for revenge, mind you, but for protection. In corporate America, you always need insurance. Encrypted copies of emails, screenshots of altered spreadsheets, records of meetings where protocols were ignored, all safely stored in multiple locations, properly documented and legally obtained during the course of my normal duties. What Bradley didn't realize was that his efforts to push me out had actually given me more time to investigate, more freedom to dig deeper into the financial discrepancies I'd been noticing. And what I found was far more interesting than simple office politics. That morning, despite having just been fired via text message, I drove to my scheduled meeting at a small coffee shop in the Woodlands. The person I was meeting had specifically chosen this location, far from downtown Houston, away from any Transitronics employees who might recognize either of us. His name was Robert Harrison, and he'd been Transitronics' CEO for 12 years before Bradley Hartwell's arrival changed everything. Robert had built that company from a regional player into a multi-state logistics powerhouse worth over $140 million. But 15 months ago, in April 2024, he'd been forced into early retirement through what the board called strategic restructuring. In reality, Bradley had orchestrated a careful campaign to make Robert look outdated and resistant to change. I'd reached out to Robert 3 weeks earlier, after discovering something that made my blood run cold. While reviewing vendor contracts for routine compliance checks, I'd found a series of payments to a consulting firm called Apex Strategic Solutions. The amounts were staggering, over $2.2 million in the past 10 months for operational optimization services. But when I dug deeper, Apex Strategic Solutions was nothing more than a shell company registered in Delaware with exactly one employee, Michael Hartwell, Bradley's older brother. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived at 11:15. Robert was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. Old CEO habits die hard. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, still sharp as a tack despite being pushed out of the company he'd built. When he saw me walking in, he didn't smile, but I could see the interest in his eyes. "Daniel," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I have to say, your timing is interesting. I got your message about wanting to discuss Transitronics irregularities, and then this morning I hear through my contacts that you've been terminated." "That's right," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. "Fired by text message about 2 hours ago. No explanation, no severance discussion, just a demand to return company equipment." Robert's expression darkened. "Bradley's work, I assume." "Without question. He's been systematically removing anyone who might question his methods. The problem is, he made a mistake with me. He should have kept me close instead of pushing me away because now I'm free to share what I've discovered." I pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between us. Robert's eyes immediately focused on it like a hawk spotting prey. "This contains documentation of financial irregularities that go back 12 months, I explained. Phantom consulting contracts, inflated vendor payments, and approval bypasses that violate both company policy and federal compliance standards." Robert opened the folder carefully and began scanning the documents. I watched his face as he processed what he was seeing. His jaw tightened, and I could practically see his corporate instincts kicking into high gear. "Apex Strategic Solutions," he said quietly, pointing to one of the invoices. $2.2 million for services that aren't even clearly defined in these contracts. "Michael Hartwell," I added, "Bradley's older brother. The company was incorporated in February 2024, just 6 weeks before Bradley joined Transitronics as operations director." "Coincidence?" "There are no coincidences in business, Daniel. Only opportunities and the people smart enough to recognize them." He closed the folder and looked at me directly. "What exactly are you proposing?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. "I'm not proposing anything illegal or unethical, but I think the current board members should be made aware of these financial discrepancies, especially considering that Transitronics is preparing for its first public stock offering in late 2026. Robert leaned back in his seat, and for the first time since I'd sat down, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "You know, Daniel, when Bradley orchestrated my removal, he made several promises to the board. Increased efficiency, reduced overhead costs, streamlined operations. But what I'm seeing here suggests that costs have actually increased, just in different categories that aren't immediately visible to board oversight." "Exactly. And there's more. I've documented at least 8 instances where Bradley bypassed the standard vendor approval process, authorizing contracts worth over $300,000 without board review. According to Transitronics' own corporate charter, any single contract exceeding $150,000 requires board approval. Charter violations." Robert's eyes gleamed. "That's serious business. the kind of thing that can invalidate contracts and create liability issues for the entire company. We spent the next hour going through every document in my folder. Robert asked detailed questions, made notes, and occasionally shook his head in what appeared to be professional disgust. As a former CEO, he understood the implications of what Bradley had been doing far better than I did. This is good work, Daniel, thorough and well documented, but collecting evidence is only half the battle. The question is how to present this information in a way that protects both of us legally, while ensuring appropriate action is taken. I've been thinking about that, I said. What if this information were to reach the right person on the board of directors, someone with the authority to order an internal audit? Margaret Singh, Robert said immediately. She's the audit committee chairwoman, and she's never liked Bradley. She found his presentation style too aggressive, and his answers to financial questions too evasive. But she'd need a compelling reason to initiate an audit, especially since Bradley has been showing improved quarterly numbers. Improved numbers that are artificially inflated by phantom consulting fees and contract manipulation, I pointed out. Precisely. But Margaret would need to receive this information through proper channels. It couldn't appear to be coming from a disgruntled former employee or a terminated CEO with an axe to grind. That's when Robert suggested something that was both brilliant and completely legal. He had maintained relationships with several board members since his departure, and he knew that Margaret Singh had been concerned about the company's rapid expansion and increased spending. If she were to receive an anonymous but well-documented report about potential financial irregularities, she would be professionally obligated to investigate. Anonymous reporting is protected under federal whistleblower statutes, Robert explained. As long as the information is factual and the concerns are legitimate, whoever submits it is protected from retaliation. By the time we finished our coffee at 12:45, we had a plan. Robert would arrange for the documentation to reach Margaret Singh through a third-party legal firm that specialized in corporate compliance. The report would be professional, factual, and completely legitimate. No accusations, just questions that demanded answers. As we prepared to leave, Robert looked at me with something approaching respect. You know, Daniel, Bradley made a serious mistake letting you go. He just handed us the perfect opportunity to expose what he's been doing. The funny thing is, I replied, I don't even want revenge. I just want the truth to come out. Let the consequences fall where they may. But as I drove home that afternoon, I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction. Bradley Hartwell thought he'd eliminated a problem by firing me. Instead, he'd created a much bigger problem for himself. And unlike him, I'd always believed in playing the long game. 5 days after my termination, on Monday, July 21st, Transatronics began to feel the impact of my absence in ways Bradley Hartwell never anticipated. The compliance report I'd been working on before my day off wasn't just any routine paperwork. It was the final certification needed for a major contract with Peterson Industries, worth $12 million over 3 years. Without my signature and validation, that report sat incomplete on someone's desk while Peterson's deadline approached. Bradley had assumed any competent analyst could finish what I'd started, but he was wrong. The report required specific knowledge of regulatory frameworks I'd developed over 17 years, cross-references to historical data that existed nowhere but in my documented processes, and risk assessments based on proprietary algorithms I'd created for the company. By Thursday, July 24th, Peterson Industries was asking questions. By Friday, they were threatening to withdraw their offer if the compliance certification wasn't delivered within 48 hours. Bradley scrambled to find someone who could complete my work, but the 2 junior analysts he'd been favoring were in over their heads within hours. I learned all this from Sarah Martinez in HR, who called me Friday evening under the pretense of discussing my equipment return. Daniel, she said quietly, it's chaos here. Bradley's been screaming at everyone, demanding they figure out your reporting system. Nobody can make sense of your files. That's unfortunate, I replied calmly, but I'm sure they'll work it out. What I didn't tell Sarah was that my files were deliberately organized in a way that required institutional knowledge to interpret. Not maliciously, mind you, but professionally. Any experienced risk analyst develops their own methodologies over nearly 2 decades. My successor would need weeks to understand my approach, assuming they had the expertise to begin with. Meanwhile, Robert Harrison had been busy. True to his word, he'd arranged for our documentation to reach Margaret Singh through a corporate compliance firm in Dallas. The package arrived at her office on Monday morning, July 28th, professionally bound and containing a cover letter that simply stated, "The enclosed materials raise questions about financial practices at Transatronics that may warrant board review." Margaret Singh was exactly the right person to receive this information. As audit committee chairwoman, she'd built her reputation on thorough oversight and zero tolerance for financial irregularities. She was also someone who remembered when Transatronics operated with transparency and accountability under Robert's leadership. By Tuesday, July 29th, Margaret had forwarded the documentation to the company's external auditing firm with a formal request for preliminary review. By Wednesday, the auditors were asking Transatronics for clarification on several vendor contracts, including the payments to Apex Strategic Solutions. That's when Bradley made his first critical mistake. Instead of cooperating fully with the audit request, he became defensive. He questioned why an audit was necessary, suggested that the anonymous report was probably from a disgruntled employee, and insisted that all vendor relationships were legitimate and properly documented. His defensiveness raised red flags for Margaret, who had been in corporate governance long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. She authorized a more comprehensive audit, this time including a review of the approval processes for all contracts exceeding $100,000. Thursday morning, August 1st, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Tom Rodriguez, a colleague I'd worked with for 8 years before he moved to the procurement department. "Daniel," he said, "I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I thought you should know. They're asking me questions about contract approvals, and your name keeps coming up." "How so?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "They want to know why so many vendor contracts were processed without your risk assessment over the past 8 months. Apparently, your signature was required on anything over 150, but there are dozens of contracts that bypass that requirement." This was better than I'd hoped. The auditors weren't just looking at the fraudulent payments to Michael Hartwell's company. They were discovering the systematic pattern of bypassed approvals that had allowed those payments to occur. By Friday, August 2nd, Bradley was in full damage control mode. He called a staff meeting to address what he termed unfounded concerns about our vendor relationships. According to Sarah, who attended the meeting, Bradley spent 40 minutes explaining why the audit was unnecessary and assuring everyone that the anonymous report was probably fabricated by someone with a personal grudge against the company's new direction. "He mentioned you specifically," Sarah told me during another carefully orchestrated phone call. "He said that recently terminated employees sometimes try to cause trouble for their former employers." "Did he actually say my name?" I asked. "Not directly, but everyone knew who he meant. The problem is people aren't buying it. Too many of us remember how thorough you were, how you always followed protocols. If you were concerned about something, there was usually a good reason. That weekend, I did something I rarely do. I allowed myself to feel satisfied. Not vindictive or angry, but professionally satisfied. Bradley had dismissed me as a dinosaur, an obstacle to his modern approach to business. But his modern approach was turning out to be nothing more than old-fashioned fraud dressed up in corporate buzzwords. Monday, August 5th brought the news I'd been expecting. Margaret Singh had called an emergency board meeting to discuss the audit findings. The preliminary report had identified significant concerns about contract approval processes and vendor relationships that required immediate attention. Bradley tried to control the narrative by scheduling individual meetings with board members before the emergency session, but his efforts backfired. Several directors mentioned his defensive attitude to Margaret, who began to suspect that the problems were more serious than initially indicated. The emergency board meeting lasted 4 hours on Tuesday, August 6th. I learned the details from Robert, who still had contacts among the directors. Bradley had been asked to explain the relationship between Transitronics and Apex Strategic Solutions, and his answers had been evasive and contradictory. When pressed about the approval process bypasses, Bradley claimed they were necessary for operational efficiency, and that the risk assessments weren't critical for routine vendor relationships. This answer particularly angered Margaret, who understood that risk assessment wasn't optional in a logistics company dealing with federal contracts and interstate commerce regulations. By Wednesday, August 7th, Bradley was suspended pending completion of the full audit. Michael Hartwell's consulting contract was immediately terminated, and all payments to Apex Strategic Solutions were frozen pending legal review. Thursday morning, August 8th, I received a call from David Park, Transitronics' current head of human resources. "Daniel," he said, "I hope you understand that your termination had nothing to do with your performance or any concerns about your work quality." "I appreciate you clarifying that," I replied. "Given the current situation, the board has asked me to reach out about the possibility of bringing you back as a consultant to help with the transition and audit compliance." I let that offer hang in the air for a moment before responding. "That's flattering, David, but I'm actually pursuing other opportunities that are a better fit for my experience level." What I didn't tell him was that Robert Harrison had already recommended me for a position with Morrison Strategic, a corporate compliance consulting firm that worked with Fortune 500 companies. The salary was 38% higher than my previous $96,000 annual salary at Transitronics, and the role would give me the authority and respect that had been slowly eroded during Bradley's tenure. That afternoon, I drove past the Transitronics building on my way to my interview with Morrison Strategic. Through the glass windows of the executive floor, I could see people moving around with the urgent energy that accompanies corporate crisis management. I felt no satisfaction in their chaos, but I did feel vindicated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply allowing the truth to surface and letting people face the natural consequences of their choices. By late August 2025, I was settling into my new office at Morrison Strategic when Robert Harrison called with an update I'd been expecting. "It's official," he said. "Bradley Hartwell has been terminated for cause, and the board has voted to pursue legal action against both him and his brother Michael for contract fraud and embezzlement." The final audit report had been devastating. Not only had they confirmed the fraudulent payments to Apex Strategic Solutions, but they'd uncovered a pattern of financial misconduct that went deeper than even I had suspected. Bradley had been systematically inflating operational costs, skimming vendor payments, and manipulating budget reports to hide his activities. The Peterson Industries contract that had fallen through after my departure was just the beginning. When word spread through the logistics industry that Transitronics was under federal investigation for compliance violations, 2 other major clients suspended their relationships with the company. The stock offering that had been planned for late 2026 was indefinitely postponed. "The board asked me to come back," Robert continued. "Interim CEO position, while they search for permanent leadership. I told them I'd consider it, but only if they agreed to implement proper oversight protocols and bring back some institutional knowledge." "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it. Robert deserved the chance to rebuild what Bradley had nearly destroyed. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. They're going to need a new head of corporate compliance, someone who understands both the regulatory environment and the company's operational needs. The board specifically asked about you." I leaned back in my chair and considered the offer. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at the chance to return to Transitronics in a senior leadership role. But Morrison Strategic had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing: respect for my expertise and the authority to implement proper risk management protocols across multiple companies. "I appreciate the confidence, Robert, but I'm quite happy where I am. Morrison has contracts with companies that actually value thorough compliance work." "I understand completely," he said, "but I want you to know that your documentation was instrumental in exposing what Bradley was doing. Without your careful record-keeping, he might have gotten away with it." That afternoon, I received another call, this one from Margaret Singh. As the audit committee chairwoman, She wanted to thank me personally for what she called maintaining professional standards under difficult circumstances. The board realizes now that Mr. Hartwell's approach was not just unethical, but dangerous, she explained. We should have listened more carefully when longtime employees started expressing concerns. I never expressed concerns directly, I pointed out. No, but your departure sent a clear message. When someone with your reputation and experience level is suddenly terminated, it raises questions. The anonymous report simply gave us the documentation we needed to ask those questions properly. Over the following weeks, I watched from my new position as Transitronics struggled to rebuild its reputation. The federal investigation resulted in significant fines for compliance violations, and the civil lawsuit against Bradley and Michael Hartwell was ongoing. The company had to hire 3 new risk analysts just to handle the backlog of incomplete assessments that had accumulated during Bradley's tenure. My former colleagues kept me updated on the internal situation. Sarah Martinez from HR told me that Bradley had tried to blame his termination on a conspiracy of old guard employees who couldn't adapt to modern business practices. But with Robert back as interim CEO and the audit findings public, no one was buying that narrative. He actually had the nerve to suggest that you had planted false documents, Sarah said during one of our catch-up conversations. But the auditors confirmed that everything in the anonymous report was legitimate and properly sourced. The irony wasn't lost on me. Bradley had fired me because he saw me as an obstacle to his plans, but my termination had actually accelerated his downfall. If he'd kept me around, I might never have connected with Robert Harrison. I might never have compiled all the evidence in one place. I certainly wouldn't have been free to meet with former board members and provide the documentation that triggered the audit. 3 months later, I ran into Tom Rodriguez at a Houston Astros game in September. He'd left Transitronics in August to join a smaller logistics firm that offered better advancement opportunities. You know what's funny, Daniel? He said as we watched the pregame warm-ups. Bradley always talked about modernizing the company and getting rid of dead weight. But when everything fell apart, it turned out that guys like you were actually the foundation that kept everything stable. Experience has value, I replied, but only when it's respected. The new compliance head they hired is good, but she's been asking everyone about your old protocols. Turns out your system wasn't outdated after all. It was just thorough. That evening, I reflected on everything that had happened since that text message fired me on my day off in July. I could have been angry. I could have been vindictive. Instead, I'd chosen to be strategic, to work within the system, and to let the truth speak for itself. Bradley Hartwell had assumed that removing me would clear the path for his schemes. He was wrong. My 17 years at Transitronics had taught me that the most effective way to handle corporate corruption isn't through dramatic confrontations or public accusations. It's through careful documentation and proper channels. Today, I work with companies across multiple industries, helping them build compliance systems that prevent the kind of problems that destroyed Bradley's career. I earn $132,000 annually, have greater professional respect, and wake up each morning knowing that my work actually matters. I never sued Transitronics for wrongful termination. I never sought public recognition for exposing Bradley's fraud. I simply did what I'd always done. Thorough professional work that spoke for itself. Sometimes the best revenge is no revenge at all. Sometimes it's just being so good at what you do that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And sometimes when someone tries to destroy your career, the most satisfying response is to build an even better one. The last I heard, Bradley Hartwell was working at a small regional trucking company in Oklahoma, making about $42,000 a year, less than half of what he used to earn. His brother Michael was facing federal charges for wire fraud and tax evasion. Transitronics, under Robert's leadership, had begun to recover its reputation and was actually performing better than it had during Bradley's tenure. As for me, I'm exactly where I belong, doing work I believe in with people who value expertise over politics and results over rhetoric. That text message on my day off turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to my career. If you enjoyed this story, like this video, and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, Please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.